Well, hello, and welcome to another Discover Headless Tech interview from headlesscreator.com. I'm Marcelo Loom, the Headless Creator. As always, you can get a hold of me right there. My email address, marcelo@headlesscreator.com. Today, we're going to have a really excellent conversation. I'll give you a heads up. It's going to be a two-parter. I know it says, doesn't say that, but it's going to be a two-parter because we have a lot to cover. It's all about the digital experience composition, also known as DXC, brand new term in the industry, which you're going to learn all about. My guest is Adam Conn. He's the VP of Enablement at Uniform. Full disclosure, I work for Uniform, you know that. And he is my boss. So very, very cool guy. But we're gonna get to him in just a minute. But you know how this works. Go get your free account. You need it. You want it. You'll love it. Get the account. You'll have access to this episode on demand right after we're done. But then you're also going to have access to the entire course, which includes not just the podcast, which you can see down here, but it includes all the tutorials, upcoming tutorials and interviews. And then, of course, you'll have access to pretty much everything on the site, including Content Modeling Weekly, the weekly tip courses. We have tons of Headless EMS courses. Bootcamp course. We're about to launch a super cool new course, which I can't tell you about, but you will know next week because it's going to be live next week. So go ahead and get your free account. You won't regret it. And also, I do want to tell you that this will be available on demand right after, also in Apple Podcasts. And if you have questions, put them in the chat because we'll ask Adam those questions. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and bring on Adam. Adam, welcome.
Hey, Marcelo. It's great to be here. I really love these podcasts, and I appreciate the chance to be a part of it.
I'm happy to have you here. We're both in the same time zone, which means it's super early. We're both super early birds here. So for those watching around the world, it's, 7:30 here, but I think we've been up since 5. Or for you, I think 4:30, you said.
Yeah. I had a call with some people in Europe.
Yep. That's typical for today. So, hey, let's start with a little bit about your background. Just how did you get into tech?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in technology and kind of helping people learn about it. I started with an Apple PC when I was a kid. Didn't have internet or even dial-up service. My brother would play video games on it, and I'd write little programs in BASIC. And I loved creating Easter eggs, even though I didn't know the name for it back then.
Right.
I think I spent more time adding those into my programs than the programs themselves.
Right. What Apple did you have?
It was an Apple IIgs.
Oh man, I got into the Apple II Plus.
Yeah, I'm not sure how my parents found the Apple IIgs and why they picked that one, but that was it had great graphics for the time, but I never really saw one outside of my home. We didn't have them in the schools or anything.
We had them at school. At home I had a Commodore VIC-20 and then a 64, but at school we had the TI-99 4A and the Apple 2 Plus. It was back then, but I am older than you, so it's okay.
Well, we had the Apple 2 Pluses. It's just the 2GS, that specific model, we didn't have in the schools or anything.
Yeah, I don't remember that one. But hey, people didn't come for the history of Apple here, although it could make for a cool podcast actually. So anyway, yeah, you got into computers through the Apple.
Yeah, so I studied business and technology in college, but the business part was kind of for a silly reason. I wanted to live in a certain dorm my freshman year, and that was only open to business students. So I signed up for management information systems, which was kind of a combination of like computer science and business. It really turns out that it's training to be a consultant for systems integrator, which is what my first job ended up being.
Cool. Yeah, I did CIS, which is the same thing as MIS, Computer Information Systems. It was the mixture of business and computers.
And then kind of the training and the learning and the education part came in college because I had a work-study job as a teaching assistant for a statistics course. And my main job was really helping the students with a statistics program, which coincidentally was called ASP. It had nothing to do with Microsoft's ASP.
Right.
But this was back when few students had their own PCs and nobody had a laptop. So people were coming into a computer lab to get their work done. So that's where I learned that I liked helping people understand how to use the program, and it seemed like I did a good job at it. So, training is something that I've been able to continue to do throughout.
Just came natural to you. Yeah. What you're doing now, you're VP of Enablement at Uniform. So prior to Uniform, what were you doing? Like, what was your previous job?
Yeah, so I've worked in content management and digital experience space for a long time. My first job was at CMS vendor, was early 2000s, at a company called Red Dot. And Red Dot had these two separate products, which is interesting because these products really represent the two extremes that the industry sort of swings between. On the one hand, you've got static site generation, and on the other hand, you've got dynamic page rendering. So Red Dot actually had these two separate products. The static site generation product was built on ASP and not even ASP.NET. This is the original
like 3.0. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other one was built on Java using Tomcat. But the best part of this is that they were actually able to convince customers to buy it. And this was when organizations were pretty firmly Microsoft or Java shops.
Right.
So I started there as a trainer and courseware developer, and moved on to partner enablement, which is basically training and courseware development for implementation partners with some relationship management stuff added in. And after that, I moved to another CMS vendor, Sitecore. And this was when Sitecore was just starting their transition from CMS into something bigger. So I was there for 8.5 years in a variety of roles, doing product marketing, development. I led a team of architects. I built an integration practice. So that was a great experience, but 8.5 years is a long time in tech. So it was time to try something different. So joined a CDP vendor named Lytics, but I wasn't there for too long before we started Uniform.
So that's one thing I failed to mention is you're one of the founders, the 3 founders to Uniform. How did Uniform, kind of short story, because I'm sure it was much longer than we have time for, but how did it come to be?
Yeah, so Lars Peterson, Alex Sheba, and I were the 3 founders at Uniform, and we worked together at Sitecore. We all had different areas of expertise there, but we worked together on a lot of projects, and so we knew each other professionally and personally. We all left Sitecore about the same time. Alex and Lars started a boutique digital agency. I went to work for the CDP. Less than a year later, they called me up and told me that this idea they had, because they saw the potential for enterprise content management and digital experience management for kind of companies that are invested in that technology to really be transformed by a lot of the innovation that's coming out of like the headless CMS vendors and kind of these next generation CDNs like Netlify. And they thought that with my background with integrations, that was the missing piece that they needed to make a go of it. So that's really where Uniform came from.
That's awesome. Very cool. Well, we're going to jump in because we got a lot to cover. And like I mentioned at the intro, this is probably going to turn into a part 2. We'll see how we progress here, but we have a lot to talk about. Real quick, this is about DXC. And like a full disclosure, I work for Uniform as well. We have a DXCA, which is the DXC assembly, coming up November 15th. If people want to find out more about it, it's going to be all about DXCA or DXC. They can go to uniform.to/DXCA-HC. Just wanted people to know that. But if you're ready, we're going to jump in. We're going to start with terminology. Then we're going to get into what is DXC. Then we're going to talk about how do we acquire a DXC, and then the day-to-day management of a DXC. We may not get to all of that on this one, to be honest with you, because there's a lot to talk about. So let's start with terminology. We got to set, a minimum bar here for people we can all be on the same page. Let's start with this word that people use constantly, composability.
Yeah, so composability is definitely the buzzword of the day. But at its core, composability describes something that's kind of vague. And that's the idea that a system's designed with the expectation that it's going to be connected to other systems. And this isn't the same thing as being able to be connected to other systems, because it's hard to even think of a system these days that doesn't support some sort of integration. Integration is an essential part of modern technology. But there is a big difference between supporting integration and expecting integration. And I've been doing systems integration for my entire career. Getting multiple systems to work together is never as easy as anyone makes it out to be. But when a system's designed with the expectation that it will be integrated, it makes integration a whole lot easier. So not easy, but easier.
Well, give an example of that. What do you mean by it's designed to be integrated versus it's not?
Yeah. So one of the other kind of buzzwords that's thrown around a lot is API first. And I think API first is a good example of this. If you're building your system around APIs, you're expecting that those APIs are going to be used, and you are building your system in a way that kind of is around those APIs, as opposed to starting with like a user interface and building a system around a user interface and then adding APIs on for integration later. There's just a very fundamental difference in the way that you implement them, because in one case, you're building something that you know other people are going to be using because you're using them yourself. You're building your application around it. Whereas if you're adding integration on top of a product that already exists, you're trying to fill some gaps, or you're trying to accommodate requirements that are coming later.
Got it. So the way I think of composability in my mind is sort of like Lego pieces. You know, I need a yellow piece here, so I don't need to paint it every single time I need that. I just grab a yellow piece and plug it in, and now I have that piece. Is that what we mean by composability and using the API to get to that?
It is, and that's a really common analogy that's used, Lego, and I think it's a good one, and I use it quite a bit myself. But I think one of the parts of the analogy that is not focused on as much, people are they connect immediately to the idea that you're putting the parts together. But just as important, a part of composability is the fact that you can remove those pieces once they're put together. So with Lego, you don't glue the pieces together. That's the kind of the, one of the points of Lego is that you put something together and then you can break it apart and put something else together. That's an important part of composability. And I think that, we'll get into DXC, but that's a big part of why DXC is needed, is to prevent people from, gluing their Lego pieces together.
So being decoupled, right? The possibility of being fully decoupled is the key to composability.
Being decoupled and staying decoupled.
Got it. Right.
Because there is a difference between being composable and being composed. Being composed is you can take all these composable pieces and put them together, but now are they stuck together, or can you separate them later on?
I see. Okay. And there's some challenges with that too, which we're going to get into that later, right? Mach is another term. And we're going through all the terms here because we want to make sure that we all get it, because there's so much terminology and acronyms out there. Explain Mach, and how does that fit within this whole big picture?
Yeah, so Mach or Mac, I usually hear Mach, but I also hear about like Macathons, so I don't know.
Right.
But Mac is an acronym that stands for Microservices, API First, Cloud, and Headless. And it describes the design of a system that can be used in a composable architecture. So in other words, if you create a product and you build it in this way, using microservices, API First, delivering it from the cloud and making it headless, your product will be composable. But it's really a marketing term that's created by people who founded the Mach Alliance, which is a technology advocacy group. So I try not to get too hung up on what the acronym itself means. I just think of it as a product that's described as Mach certified is a product that's composable.
Got it. But what's the difference? I'm sorry. What's the difference between composability and microservices? Because the M is in there. So can you explain that, and please finish your thought?
Yeah, and that's microservices is one of the big reasons why I try not to get hung up on the literal definition of what Mach is, because to me, a microservice is a technical design decision, and you can certainly have a composable product that is not built on microservices. And I don't know why anybody would really care if the product they bought is built on microservices or not. I think the idea of what microservices suggests is an important idea, that things are not tightly coupled and that changes can be made quickly, new features can be added in a way that wasn't really possible before. But I don't think that that's strictly requires microservices to happen. So I also would not conflate composable with microservices, because you could build a monolithic system on microservices. Just because a system is built on microservices doesn't mean that those services are exposed to anybody to use. And it doesn't mean that you can't compose those microservices in a way that becomes a monolith.
Right. So microservices could be a piece of a bigger part of that composability. Like for example, a headless CMS is brought into the composable system, but it could be made up of a whole bunch of microservices.
Yeah. But again, I also wouldn't insist on microservices as being a terribly important detail of a system.
Yeah.
Like if you're looking at a system that is calling itself composable, the first question I would ask would not be, is this built on microservices? I would be looking at the APIs and kind of understanding the product. And if they chose to implement it using microservices, great. But if they didn't, that wouldn't be a deal breaker.
Right. Yeah, totally. All right, moving on to our terminology here. Automation. How does that fit?
Yeah. So automation is just when you use a machine to handle a repetitive task. And I think for Headless Creator audience, I'd imagine some of the most familiar kind of everyday examples of automation come from DevOps. You know, the way that you can commit a change to a source code repository and have a static site get generated. That's automation. I don't know that automation and composability are related, and they often involve one another. But you can have a composable system without automation, and you can definitely have automation outside of composable systems.
I see. Cool. Orchestration. That's another one that I keep hearing about, and I just think of music when I hear about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, going back to like its meaning in the sense of music, I think is one of the most helpful ways of understanding what it is.
Right.
At least to me, because to me, it is a term that means different things to different people. But the basic idea is in an orchestra, a conductor is getting these different musicians to work together to create this one piece of music. And when you're listening to the piece of music, you're not hearing violins and horns. You're hearing the composition itself, the music. I mean, that's what orchestration, to me anyways, is what the goal of it is and why it's relevant to composable architectures. Because the goal of a composable architecture should be that you've got these multiple systems working together. Orchestration is critical in order for that to happen. But orchestration also doesn't come automatically as a part of creating a composable architecture. Or in other words, by selecting a bunch of composable products and pulling them together into an architecture, that does not give you orchestration. Orchestration is something different that sits on top of those different products that are pulled together.
But it's almost like handling traffic too, right? Not just conducting, but handling traffic and routing properly from one place to another, right? Would that be considered part of orchestration as well?
Yeah. Yeah. In my mind, it's everything that's needed in order for these systems to work together, for things to move smoothly, for workflows to span multiple systems. Another thing of orchestration that I think is important to mention is that, and a way that it's a little different than automation, is that with orchestration, I don't think you're really trying to hide the fact that there are multiple systems involved. It's perfectly fine that there are multiple systems involved, and that's really one of the virtues of a composable architecture. Right. But composability tries to create a situation where you don't notice it. It doesn't matter to you that you're really using 5 different systems to get this task done, because you're able to move between these systems so easily. And it's just a very natural experience for you to get the work done.
Well, and continue with that analogy of music, right? Then that means that you could easily replace that violinist, although you may have a better violinist than others, right? But you could replace that one. And from the audience perspective, in this case, it would be the authoring, the content authors, right? To them, they're just listening to the full final piece of the music. It doesn't matter that that violinist now is somebody else, right? And the orchestration, the conductor takes care of all that. I know we're pushing this to the limits here on the analogy, but right? I mean, at the end of the day, you hear that final piece of music and you don't know who is that violinist.
Yeah, that's the goal. Now, I've never played in an orchestra, so
right.
I don't want to insult anybody who has, but yeah. I think the idea of what you described about being able to replace a violinist, that in theory is what you can do with a composable architecture. In reality, I don't know if it's as easy as replacing a violinist, because replacing a violinist, violinists all do the same thing. They all know how to read music in the same format.
I hear a whole bunch of violinists now send all emails to Adam, please, not me.
But I mean, they've standardized in a way
No, I
that
know.
technology hasn't standardized. So
Right.
I completely agree that the promise of composability, and there is talk about the potential of having that sort of plug and play, snap in capabilities. But I also, when I talk to people, I try to temper that. It's not that easy today, and I'm not sure that it ever will be that easy. But what composability gives and what something like DXC offers is a much clearer path to making that possible, and creates sort of a framework or a shell to help you get there much easier than you've ever been able to in the past.
Yeah, and I think part of that composability is not so much about, hey, we have this CMS, we're going to replace it with another one. It's more like we have multiple CMSs and we want to bring it all together into one view, right? I think that's really the power, because like you said, when an organization, enterprise is embedded into a CMS, they're usually going to stick with that, because the migration from one to another, beyond disconnecting it from the composable system, is migrating content. There's a lot involved in that, which isn't easy, right?
Yeah.
So that
For sure, but
composability.
there's also the idea of composability is the promise of not having to replatform in the future.
Right.
And that's what you were just talking about. To me, makes me think of how people think about replatforming, and the idea that, yeah, you're not going to just replace your CMS because it's not easy to do. And people don't go into implementing a CMS figuring that, well, it might not work out, I'm going to swap it out. But what I think is much more realistic is the scenario that you gave, where there could be multiple CMSs,
Right.
but also that over time you outgrow a CMS and you might want to move out of it. And what composability and what DXC offers is a path where you're not replatforming, where you can incrementally move off of one system to another, without having to rip out everything, because everything is tightly coupled to that particular CMS. Even if it's a headless CMS, that is a risk that without something like a DXC, you are tightly coupling your front end to the different systems that are providing content. So your headless CMS. But DXC and composability, the idea behind that is that you're not doing that anymore. Your front end is not tightly coupled to any specific CMS, which means that if you do need to switch out the CMS or add in another CMS for whatever reason, that's less work for you to have to do because your front end is already decoupled.
So I want to bring a concrete example on that, right, for replatforming. So if you're migrating away from one CMS into another one, what you're saying is you would connect the second CMS, let's say, and slowly start bringing that into that front end just by the orchestration of it as you migrate from one CMS to another, right? Because there's still the migration of content and media assets and things that there's no standard on the back end of CMSs that people can just swap the content like that.
Right. I would say, to use a very concrete example, let's say that you've got some product information, some marketing product information in your CMS, and you're moving from one CMS to another. You've got a web page that displays the product information, and you are displaying the name of the product, the price of the product, and the product image. That information might all be coming from your CMS or for your PIM, or wherever it's coming from.
Right.
With traditional headless systems, your front end, you're writing your front end, and your front end code is making calls directly to those underlying systems. With composability and with DXC, what you're doing is there's another layer in between there. So your front end only knows about product information, and it doesn't care that the product information came from one CMS or another CMS. It just knows that it's going to be getting product information. And then you can switch elsewhere that, okay, now this image is no longer coming from the first CMS. Now it's coming from the second CMS.
Right.
And the front end doesn't have to change.
Right. And that's how you can slowly migrate from one CMS to the other without a full interruption and without touching the front end code, because the front end code is going through the orchestration system and not directly to the headless CMS system.
Yep.
Yep, definitely. All right. So let's talk about digital experience management. What is that?
Yeah. So digital experience and digital experience management, it's a little bit of jargon, but I think it is helpful jargon. Brands and organizations and governments that connect with their customers and members and constituents in different ways, they do a lot of this digitally. So whether it's a website or a mobile app or email, digital sign, so on, there's a lot of different ways. So when you visit a website, that's considered a digital experience. You're having a digital experience. So the website can be called digital experience. Reading an email is a digital experience, or interacting with a kiosk at an airport. These are all digital experiences. So the word digital experience, even though it is a little jargony, I think it's useful because it kind of categorizes these things, because the technology that powers them is usually the same. I mean, digital experience management is the description of the work that's involved in building and maintaining those digital experiences. And one other thing, I guess, to mention on this topic is sometimes digital experience is abbreviated as DX, which is a little confusing because
Right.
developer experience is also abbreviated as DX. So if you're straddling these two worlds, you'll need to pay attention when somebody mentions DX.
We have way too many acronyms in this industry. But also, we're talking about the digital experience, but there's also sort of the offline where you're doing printing and stuff, but that requires content that may be coming from a CMS, correct? And
Yeah.
so how does
Yeah.
that come into effect in the whole digital experience management?
So oftentimes, digital experience products will have hooks into other kind of offline channels, because even offline channels, you've got a print document that is produced digitally, even though it's not delivered digitally, it's still produced digitally. So that fits into this space as well.
Got it. Okay, cool. We're getting really close to DXC, and I got to tell you, this may turn into 3 parts, not 2, because we're already 30 minutes into the stream, believe it or not, Adam. But DXP, I mean, we have digital experience management, right, which is the managing of all this stuff, and then we have DXP.
Yeah, and I hope that I imagine that the audience is excited about DXC, but I think this context is really important because it all kind of builds on
Right.
earlier things. So DXP is digital experience platform, and that's the type of product that gives you the tools to do digital experience management. So it's building, managing, delivering, optimizing digital experiences. It grew out of the last generation of content management systems, because as these CMSs started to grow, they were adding functionality like personalization and analytics. But at this point, a product is more than a CMS, but what is it? So that's where the name of the category, DXP, the Digital Experience Platform, kind of came from. And just to kind of put this into some perspective, the DXP market, the Digital Experience Platform market, is about $10 billion per year. The headless CMS market, do you know what this is?
No.
So, it's less than half a billion. So less than $500 million per year. So DXP is literally 20 times as big a business as headless CMS is. So this is technology that a lot of money is spent on. Even if you haven't been exposed to the term DXP, they're out there, and the organization you work for is very likely using it.
So does this pertain only to headless CMSs? You mentioned, $500 million, which I knew it wasn't as big, right? The market. What about traditional CMSs? Does DXP encompass that as well?
Yeah, that I'm not sure what the numbers are on, because I think largely DXP has supplanted traditional CMSs.
Okay.
It's what brands are buying. Brands go in and when they see a CMS, and that's often the entry point for DXP. Customer has a need for CMS, but then the vendors of DXP start talking to them and say, well, how are you going to use that content? Don't you want to do all of this stuff? And well, you need a DXP in order to do all of this other stuff.
Right. Okay, cool. So we've arrived. We made it. We've gone through the whole thing. DXC. Let's define DXC, and let's talk about how did it evolve. I mean, we kind of did talk about how it evolved, right? We went through all the terminology there. But how did we get here, and what is DXC?
Yeah, so DXC, digital experience composition, which when you're talking about DXC and DXP, they even literally sound the same.
Yeah.
So kind of have to spell them out whenever I say them. But the digital experience composition, it's a new category that the analysts at Gartner defined earlier this year. And it's from research that was published by Mike Lowndes, John Field, Irina Gusieva, and Jim Murphy. And the idea is that when you have all these different composable systems that contribute to digital experiences, so things like the CMSs and digital asset management systems, DAMs, customer data platforms, CDPs, PIMs, product information management systems, and so on, all these different systems, when you've got these different systems, then some challenges arrive. So imagine that you want to create a new landing page for a promotion that you're planning. You've got product details coming from a PIM, marketing information coming from a CMS, product images coming from a DAM. If you're a developer and you're building a web application, what do you need to do? So you install the SDK or maybe NPM packages for your PIM and your CMS and your DAM, and you create the landing page. So your PIM and CMS and DAM, they're composable and API first and all of that. So it's fairly easy for you to code all of this stuff up. But there's some real problems with this approach. So it doesn't scale to have developers doing this every time you need a new landing page, let alone to support all the other kinds of digital experiences that you want to offer. And also, it's completely inaccessible to business users who traditionally do this stuff. So the marketers and the merchandisers, they're the ones who are used to building the digital experiences. That's what they do. That's what they know. But I think the worst part of the approach is that it kind of undermines the value of composability itself, because you've just hard-coded all these systems together. And the appeal of composable products is that you're able to pick and choose the products that work best from you. And I talked a little bit about this already, about the ability or the potential to eliminate replatforming. And I think composability is really presented in this way. Because if it's easy for you to add new systems to a composable architecture, then it also should be easy to replace systems that are already in the architecture. But if you've hard-coded everything together, good luck with that. And these are the kinds of problems that DXC is really trying to solve.
So it seems there's two parts to DXC. There's the composability, the back end, where it's easy to plug and play, get things going, orchestrating, getting all that, sort of that developer. But there's also the content authoring experience where they can focus from a DXC's perspective. They can focus on the content and not so much where that content resides. So I need product X here. I'm going to add this blog article to this product X, and I need some customer information from just some customer information. I don't care that it's in Salesforce or it's in this or it's in, right. So to me, it seems like DXC covers these two aspects, right? It's supposedly in the perfect world, it makes it easier to plug and play, orchestrate, get all that going, but also from the content authoring perspective, they can focus on the content and not so much where that content is stored. Am I understanding this correctly?
You are. I would just make one correction to the terminology you're using. It's not content creation. It's actually experience creation, because the content creation still happens in the CMS. So this is not a replacement for CMS. This is identifying that there is a separate process for creating and managing content.
Got it.
And from using that content to build digital experiences.
I see. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because the DXC wouldn't store that content; it would just pull it, so you'd still manage it. And we're going to talk about that too, because when we get into the nitty-gritty of how does this really work, is what is that authoring experience when you're in a DXC, then you go to CMS and all that stuff. So we're going to get into that probably in our part 2, because based on the time that we're running today, we're not going to get there. So talk about the role of DXC in an organization. Where does it fit?
Yeah, so I guess to start with the grand vision of it all, I think the role of DXC is to make composable architectures practical and sustainable. So there's a lot to love about composability. So I don't want there to be any mistaking my enthusiasm for composability, but there are some real challenges in adopting composable technology. And I think you need to think about composable technology kind of as a toolkit. If you don't know how to operate power tools, as an example, you can cause a lot of damage if you're trying to learn on the job. And not sure I'm going to be able to continue this power saw or this power tool metaphor, but you can kind of think of DXC as being the person who knows how to use power tools safely. It's the person who can come in and knows knows the safety gear to use, knows what the parameters, what one tool is best used for and what another tool is best used for, and kind of coordinates and orchestrates the work that needs to be done.
Got it. Okay. But it would be a system in itself in an organization.
It is, but it also isn't necessarily one single thing, one easy thing to understand where all the functionality is coming from. So as by comparison, a headless CMS, it's very clear to people what a headless CMS is. It does its thing, and it's not terribly useful by itself, but you can use it by itself. DXC is more complicated because of this orchestration aspect to it, that it's doing things for developers, it's doing things for marketers, it's doing things for the people who are visiting the site or having the digital experience. So it's a little more complicated to kind of get your head wrapped around what exactly a DXC is.
Well, and then we spoke about also a headless CMS, a digital asset management system, but there are also internal systems in an organization that are not third-party systems that they created, right? Would a DXC manage those or orchestrate those as well?
Yeah,
potentially.
It can because what a DXC is a DXC kind of has 3 layers to it.
Right, and that was going to be my question: is the architecture? So perfect segue.
So the way that Gartner defines it, DXC has these 3 layers or tiers to it. But in order to explain it, we actually need to talk about there being 4 layers. So I'm going to try to be clear on this, but there are a lot of diagrams out there that visualize this stuff. So I think if you find a picture of it for people who learn more visually, it will be clearer for them. But think of it as just there being 4 layers in this diagram. And at the bottom, we have all these different systems that are involved with building and maintaining digital experiences. So like I've been saying, the CMS, the commerce system, the DAM, even those custom systems, backend systems that Marcelo, you were just mentioning. Mm-hmm. Those aren't a part of the DXC. So I said DXC has 3 layers, but the diagram has 4 layers. The bottom layer are these other systems. So they aren't a part of the DXC, which is kind of interesting because you need them in order for a DXC to do anything useful. But it's also the point. The DXC isn't a replacement for those systems. It just gets them to work together. So above those systems, that's where the 3 layers of the DXC are. So the first layer, or the layer that's on top of those underlying systems, that's the API framework layer. And this connects the layers above the API framework layer with those systems that are at the bottom layer. And the main thing at this layer are pre-built connectors. So when you get a DXC, the DXC is going to give you connectors to the different systems that are going to be at that bottom layer of your architecture. And I would expect that a DXC also will give you some sort of an SDK or API that you can use to build additional connectors for those custom systems that you have, or for systems that the vendor hasn't built a connector for you for. Mm-hmm. The next layer up then, so above the API framework layer, is the experience builder layer. And this is really the most visible part of DXC. And this is what enables business users to do what we were just talking about, the building the digital experiences using those connected systems. So using the systems that are at the bottom through the API framework layer. And this, again, just to reiterate, is not content management. You're not creating content at this step. You are building the digital experience. So the content is coming from the CMS, or it's coming from the commerce system.
Right. You're putting it all together, right?
Yeah. And this experience builder layer is a huge part of what's missing in the headless and composable worlds. So the ability for the non-developers to build this kind of stuff.
And we're talking about here sort of a no-code kind of visual environment.
Yes.
Which is what marketers and content authors are used to in the traditional CMS space, right?
Yeah. No code, low code, that's a part of the product category. And there are a lot of different ways that vendors will solve this problem, but the idea is that it should be available to the non-developers, marketers, merchandisers. They should be able to do this without having to be developers.
Got it. So to recap, we had the API level at the bottom, right? With an SDK kind of thing. Then you have connectors on top of that, which allow you to connect to other systems, correct?
Well, the connectors are a part of that API framework.
Of that API. Okay.
So the API framework layer is that bottom layer of the DXC. Above that is the experience builder layer,
Right.
which I was just describing, and then the third
Mm-hmm.
layer, the top layer, is the front end orchestration layer. And this is the part that developers typically are hooking into. And this is all the technology that's involved with making digital experiences that are created at the experience builder layer using content and data from the API framework layer, making those experiences available to visitors and customers. And this is where the front end applications implemented and connections to the systems involved with like deploying and delivering different kinds of digital experiences. That's where all that stuff lives.
Got it. Okay.
So there's a lot of stuff in here, but it's really providing integration and orchestration and coordination across multiple systems. So it is going to be somewhat complex, but I think Gartner did a really good job of kind of breaking it up into these 3 tiers and defining what the tiers do, but also doing it in a way that is not prescriptive. It's not telling you how it needs to happen, just telling you this is what's expected from these different layers and justifying why each layer is necessary.
Okay, sounds good. And let's grab that diagram that you were talking about. We'll post it in the bonus for people to be able to download in the Discover Headless Tech course. So we'll post a link to one of those diagrams so people can visualize that much better afterwards. Okay, so basically, I think for this part 1, we're going to end up with the DXC overview. We're going to continue on part 2 with acquiring DXC and also managing a DXC and the future of that. So I've got just 3 more questions for you to wrap up this part 1 here. Let's talk about the benefits of DXC for marketers, and then if you can tackle the benefits for developers, and then for everybody else, because in a project you have lots of other people, right? Product managers, project managers, content architects. So if you can tell us a little bit about what are the benefits of the DXC for those.
Okay, yeah. So there are a lot of benefits, and I think calling out marketers and developers is a good way to approach this, because those are the two roles that are most directly, I think, impacted by this.
Mm-hmm.
So marketers, the benefit to them is that they get to take back a lot of the control that they were used to having when they were using the digital experience platforms, the DXPs, but they lost in the move to headless and composable products. So they don't have to wait for developers to find time to help them with everyday tasks that are involved with building and managing digital experiences. That's a part of their job. They should be able to do it. So this re-empowers them to do that. It lets them build things like landing pages and configure promotions and these sorts of things by themselves. So it enables them to get their work done faster and more efficiently, and to respond to changing business needs faster than if they have to put everything into a ticketing system for developers to handle. The benefits for developers then are, first of all, that they don't have to spend time on these different tasks that DXCs enable marketers to handle for themselves. And these aren't interesting tasks for most developers. They're repetitive and they're not really challenging. Another benefit, I think, also because DXC provides an API framework or a connectivity layer, kind of that first layer of the DXC, it reduces the number of different APIs that developer needs to be juggling. And if you think about a relatively simple composable architecture, you might have 3 or 4 different systems that are involved. With a DXC, developer is able to focus on the data that's coming from those systems, rather than all the integration code that's needed to get the data from those different systems. And this is a huge benefit in terms of maintainability, because instead of hard coding your front end to these different systems, you write code to the single API, and then the DXC handles the connection to those different systems.
Got it. So you have an SDK for the DXC specifically, and that's what you're dealing with from a developer point of view.
I think that's a fair expectation. Not all DXCs will do it the exact same way, but ultimately there is some layer of abstraction that the API framework offers, right, so that your front end doesn't have to be writing code directly to the different systems. And then for the benefits to other constituencies, I think that that DXC provides a really important service when composable architecture is used. And the general message in the industry is that you can build all this stuff yourself because Mach products or headless products or whatever they are, they're so easy to integrate. But again, and not to harp on this, but the challenge isn't integration. It's getting those systems to work together. It's the orchestration. And it's pretty unrealistic for most organizations to be able to build this kind of functionality themselves. It's way more difficult than integration. So organizations that adopt composable technology, the organization themselves can benefit from getting a product that fills these gaps that they may not even realize exist until they start moving in the direction of using headless and composable products. And that's a kind of a big challenge and a big thing that I'm not sure in the headless and composable world gets enough attention, that building this stuff yourself is not easy, even though it's easy to connect the different systems. But then I think the biggest opportunity for DXC is to an organization and to a variety of roles in an organization is that it unlocks new ways for marketers and developers and other teams to work together. The old way of working where design needs to come first and then front end development and then content creation and then finally you're able to build experiences from all of this stuff. You can still support that. So if that's working for you, that doesn't have to go away. But with DXC, you don't have the dependencies that force development to be finished before you can start on experience building. So, I mean, this really enables some ideas that analysts have been talking about for a while. Gartner calls it composable business. Forrester calls it experience architecture. But if you think about what composable architecture does for technology, in terms of letting a brand pick the products that they want to use and making it possible for them to work together better, apply that same model to how teams work together. That's what DXC can unlock for teams. And that should be exciting for any organization where you've got different teams responsible for different parts of this puzzle. You've got a marketing team that has its own management structure and a technology team that reports into a separate part of the organization. This sort of orchestrating technology allows, we talk about it as it lets marketers be marketers and doesn't try to dumb down developer tasks so that marketers can do it. And it also doesn't do the reverse. It doesn't try to turn developers and other technology people into marketers or tries to kind of dumb down marketing tasks so that developers can do it. It really does let different roles do what they're good at and allows these groups to work together.
So DXC is really, it doesn't remove developers. Let's clarify that. You still need developers, right? But it seems like it refocuses everybody into what they're good at, right? Developers are good at coding really cool stuff and not managing content through code, right? And marketers are good at creating content and marketing and all that kind of stuff. So it refocuses the people and allows them to do their best job as opposed to people doing somebody else's job.
For sure. And I'm really optimistic for developers with DXC, because you could look at DXC as taking work away from developers, but I'd argue pretty strongly that most developers don't want to be doing the work that DXC takes away from them in the first place. It frees them for their time to be spent on the kinds of problems that engineers like solving, like the tough problems, rather than writing code to pull content from a headless CMS.
Right. Yeah, totally. Okay. So not everything is rosy and great. What are some of the challenges? I mean, there's always challenges with everything.
Yeah. So this is kind of a tough one, because I'm not sure that I see many challenges for marketers, because without DXC, marketers are in a pretty bad place. They're totally disempowered. Mm-hmm. Developers, maybe a developer could look at it that you're taking work away from them, but I don't think that that's, I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think if I have to identify a challenge of DXC, it's more a challenge for DXC than a challenge with DXC. Because DXC itself is a solution to a problem that I think a lot of people haven't faced firsthand. So it can be hard for people to understand why it's so important. And the risk is that without DXC, I have a really hard time seeing composable architectures, especially for digital experience management, really becoming mainstream. it'll remain kind of what it is today, which is a niche technology that's only practical for the most mature organizations. And that's not to say that kind of headless and composable technology isn't being adopted. It definitely is being adopted, but I wouldn't describe it as being mainstream today. And I think that part of that is that there isn't these tools like a DXC to fill the gaps that really do exist. And I think the risk there is that it opens a door for a return to the kind of monolithic systems that kind of predate composable and headless systems. And I don't think anyone working in this space for any amount of time is hoping for that.
Yeah, and we're going to tackle that too, because then that begs the question, is it too much work? And will people just go back to monolith because it's just simpler to deal with one thing, right? But we'll tackle that next. Of course, the answer, we'll just give it away, is no, right? But
and I would say the teaser to that is that's exactly what a DXC is trying to simplify.
Right, to avoid, right, exactly. Yeah, to make easy. Now, it sounds like everything we've been talking about seems to be focused on the enterprise. What about your SMBs and small mom and pop shops that still need a web presence? How does DXC fit in those companies? Because it seems like you need a big team, you need, lots of tools.
Yeah, so I would say that DXC probably is focused a bit on the enterprise, but I wouldn't say that their value is limited to the enterprise. Okay. But I would say that the value of DXC becomes more apparent in more complex environments. And complexity might be technical, so that might be the number of different systems that are in your architecture. Or complexity could be organizational, like having completely separate teams responsible for content and experiences and technologies. I think so. SMB definitely this could make sense for them. The smaller mom and pop shops, they probably don't have the complexity to make it worthwhile.
Right. Maybe sometime in the future, as DXC matures, there will be different versions for different kinds of enterprises or smaller companies. Because I think it does make sense. You can have a smaller company have the complexity, just not have the budget or the team to manage all this.
Yeah, and there are, and we probably don't have time to get into this, and we can get into it in part two.
Yeah.
But within the definition of DXC, there are three types of DXCs, or three ways that Gartner sees that a vendor who is creating a DXC could go about providing that functionality. So one is kind of an offshoot of DXP, the Digital Experience Platform. Another is an offshoot of a headless CMS. And the third type is pure play, which is built specifically to solve these problems. I could see that the type of DXC that comes from a headless CMS could be an option for the smaller organizations like mom and pop, and maybe even the smaller end or the less complex end of SMB.
Got it. Okay. This is a perfect place to end. We're going to start part two with that, the three types, and then we'll get into a little bit more detail. But Adam, it's been a pleasure. The only thing we're going to have to fix for the part two is we'll have to fix that window a little bit because you're a little bit too dark right now. We want to see your face here a little bit better.
Oh, I guess that means we need to start earlier because the sun is starting to come up.
I think so. Maybe we'll do that. But that's early enough already, 7 o'clock for everybody. So anyway, Adam, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Is that email address you have there the best way to get a hold of you? Anything else you want to share?
It is. No, just thanks again for having me, Marcelo. It was a lot of fun to talk about this new product category, and I hope your audience is excited about it and looking forward to part two.
Definitely. Same here. Thank you again, Adam, and thanks to everybody else for being here today. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for part two. It's going to be great. Also, remember, if you're watching this on demand and it's post-November 15th, ignore what I'm about to say. But otherwise, you can go register for the DXCA by going to uniform.to/DXCA-HC. And it's going to be a cool conference. Anyway, remember to also check out the on-demand version, which will be available probably in about an hour. And stay tuned for part two. We'll make an announcement soon, and we'll continue our interview with Adam on part two. So again, I hope you enjoyed it, and have a great rest of the week. Cheers.